The mare went up on her hind legs, and Rook went backward into the mud. He landed hard, one hand catching the gatepost, the other slapping the ground, and for a moment he simply sat there in the churned earth of the stable yard, with his hat knocked sideways and his dignity somewhere in the straw behind him. The other grooms did not laugh. They had seen it before. 3 of them stood at a careful distance, with their arms loose at their sides, watching Vesper pace the far wall of her box, her dark coat sheened with the effort of her own fury, her breath coming in short white bursts in the cold morning air. Nora Fenn watched from the kitchen yard gate, with a bucket of vegetable scraps balanced on her hip. She had not meant to stop. She had a pot on the fire, and Mrs. Trail would notice if she lingered, and there was no reason at all for a kitchen girl to stand watching the head groom pick himself out of the mud at 7:30 in the morning. But she stopped all the same. Because of the mare. Not because the animal was frightening, though she was. Not because she was beautiful, though she was that too, in the way of things that have not yet decided whether they are wild or tame. Nora stopped because the mare was afraid. She could see it in the way Vesper held herself against the back wall of the box, with her neck low and her ears moving like something trying to hear its way to safety. Not vicious. Not evil-tempered, the way Rook kept telling anyone who would listen. Frightened was different from wicked, and Nora had known enough of both to tell them apart. Rook got to his feet and reached for his hat, and saw her watching. "You there. Kitchen. Off with you." Nora went. She went back through the kitchen yard door and hung her bucket on its hook, and returned to the fire. And she did not think about the mare again until that evening, when she was scrubbing the last of the pots, and the house had gone quiet, and she looked up at the small high window above the sink, and saw that the stable lamp was still lit. She stood at that window for a long time. Then she dried her hands, and went outside. The Duke of Alderwick had not intended to be awake. He had gone to bed at a reasonable hour, which was to say 11 o'clock, and he had read for perhaps 40 minutes. And then he had lain in the dark and listened to the house settle around him the way he always did when sleep would not come. This was most nights. He had grown accustomed to it the way a man grows accustomed to a stone in his boot, not comfortable, but no longer surprised. He rose at midnight and pulled on his coat over his nightshirt in the manner of a man who does not particularly care what he looks like when there is no one to see him, and went downstairs. He had not been heading for the stables, he had been heading for the library. But he crossed the entrance hall and took the turn toward the back corridor out of old habit. The way the body remembers routes the mind has tried to forget, and he went through the side door and across the courtyard, and he was perhaps 20 feet from the stable block when he heard the sound. Not the sound he expected. He expected the stamping, the restless circling, the low, unhappy sound that Vesper made when the night was bad and the dark pressed in around her. He had heard it so many times in the 7 years since his brother Thomas fell, that he sometimes thought he heard it in his sleep, which was perhaps part of why sleep did not come easily. What he heard instead was silence. And then, very softly, a voice. He stopped. The lamp was burning inside, and the top half of the stable door stood open, and the voice was low and even and completely unafraid, and it was saying something that he could not quite make out from where he stood. Not words, exactly, or at least not words that carried meaning, more like the rhythm of words, the shape of a sentence without the content. Edmund Vane, Duke of Alderwick, stood in his own courtyard in the dark in his nightshirt and his coat, and he did not go forward. He told himself he did not want to disturb the animal. He listened for perhaps 5 minutes, and then went back inside. He did not go to the library. He went to bed. And for the first time in several weeks he slept without difficulty, which he noted in the morning with a suspicion he could not entirely account for, and chose not to examine. Nora had not planned to go into the stable. She had told herself on the walk across the yard that she would only look, stand at the door, see that the lamp was not a fire hazard, go back to her bed in the attic room she shared with the second housemaid. That was the full extent of her intentions. But Vesper had heard her coming. The mare had gone still at the sound of Nora's footsteps on the cobbles, and when Nora reached the half door and lifted the latch to open the top portion, Vesper had turned her head, not in the way she turned it for Rook, which was sideways and sharp with her ears pinned. She turned it fully, the way a creature turns to look at something it is not sure about but has not yet decided to run from. Nora had stood there. She had not said anything clever. She had not reached out her hand. She had held the door frame loosely with both hands, and breathed slowly, and looked at a spot just to the left of the mare, the way her father had taught her when she was small enough to stand under a horse without ducking. Never look them in the eye straight off, her father had said. Makes them feel cornered. So she looked at the wall, and after perhaps 2 minutes, Vesper had taken one step toward the door. Nora had not moved. She had kept her breathing slow and her hands loose and her gaze slightly sideways, and after another minute the mare had taken another step, and then one more, and then she had extended her neck over the half door and breathed in Nora's direction in a long, slow investigation. Nora had let her. When she finally walked back to the house an hour later, her shift was damp from the cold, and her feet were numb inside her boots, and she was careful on the back stairs so as not to wake the cook who slept on the floor below. She lay down on her narrow bed without changing her clothes and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She did not go back the next night. She went back the night after. The household of Alderwick Hall ran on the authority of 3 people, which was to say it ran on Mrs. Trail, the butler. Mr. Hewson was old and slow and entirely decent, and he managed the wine and the silver and the front of the house with the careful attention of a man who has spent 40 years learning which details matter and which do not. The cook, a wide and capable woman called Mrs. Petch, governed the kitchen like a small and well-organised country, and nobody who worked under her entered or left without her knowing about it. And then there was Mrs. Trail, who was the housekeeper, and who knew everything. She found out about the stable on the 4th day, not from the night visits, which Nora had managed with the care of long practice in a small house where sound carried. She found out because one of the undergrooms mentioned to one of the housemaids, with the casual cruelty of someone sharing useful information, that the kitchen girl had been seen talking to Vesper through the fence in the afternoon, and the housemaid mentioned it to Mrs. Trail before supper. Mrs. Trail found Nora in the scullery at 8:45. She did not raise her voice. Mrs. Trail never raised her voice, which was in some ways worse than shouting. You have been going to the stable yard. It was not a question. Nora set down the pot she was holding. Yes, Mrs. Trail, you understand that the stable yard is not a place for kitchen staff. You understand that the Duke's horses, and in particular that animal, are not a matter for the indoor servants, and that Rook runs his yard without interference from the house. I understand. Mrs. Trail looked at her for a moment. She was a narrow woman with good eyes, and she used them. If you are found near those horses again, you will be let go without a character, and I will not argue with that decision on your behalf. Do you understand me clearly? Yes, Mrs. Trail good. Nora went back to her pots. She kept her face still the way she had learned to keep it still a long time ago, when she was 14 and her father was sick and the creditors came, and she had understood that a still face was a kind of armour that cost nothing. She did not go to the stable that night. She went 3 nights later. Edmund had taken to walking the courtyard. He would not have described it that way if anyone had asked him, and no one was likely to, since he walked at 1 o'clock in the morning and the household slept. He told himself it was the benefit of the night air, which was a reasonable explanation and bore no relationship to the actual reason, which was that he wanted to hear the voice. He heard it on the 3rd night. It was winter cold and the ground was frozen in the ruts, and he stood in the shadow of the wall with his hands in his coat pockets and listened to it move through the stillness of the stable block. He could make out the words more clearly now. Not poetry or prayer, which he had half expected. Something practical. She was telling the horse about the day. Specific things, the way the pastry had stuck to the pan at breakfast and the cook had said something sharp, and how Nora had agreed with her, which was easier than disagreeing. The price of coal. The colour of the sky that afternoon, which she described as the particular grey of a pewter spoon that needs cleaning. He realised with some degree of alarm that he was smiling. He went inside immediately. He asked Hewson the next morning, in the careful way of a man who is asking a question he has no intention of appearing to ask, who had been managing the kitchen accounts since old Mrs. Petch developed trouble with her eyes. "One of the girls, sir," Hewson said, "a Nora Fenn, came to us about 8 months ago from the parish north of Sleaford. Very capable, by Mrs. Petch her account." Edmund said nothing further on the matter. That afternoon he walked to the stable yard at 3 o'clock, which he had not done in some time, and stood at the fence with his hands behind his back and watched Vesper pace the far end of her paddock. He was the only person there. Rook had gone to the village on an errand. Vesper stopped pacing. She looked at him across the paddock with her dark eyes, and then she turned her head away, which was what she always did, and he stood there and felt the familiar weight of it and went back to the house. The arrival of Sir Geoffrey Vane was not unexpected and not welcome, which was the condition in which Sir Geoffrey generally arrived anywhere. He came in a hired chaise on a Tuesday, which was 3 weeks after Nora had first gone to the stable, and he brought with him a travelling bag, a manservant, and an opinion about the management of Alderwick Hall that he had clearly been saving up since his last visit. Sir Geoffrey was the Duke his father's younger brother, which made him Edmund's uncle by blood and his heir by the current absence of any better candidate. He was 62, healthy, prosperous, and deeply interested in the question of when Edmund intended to do something about the succession. He had a way of phrasing this interest that made it sound like concern. He was shown to his usual rooms, and changed for dinner, and appeared in the dining room at 7, with the expression of a man performing a health inspection. The fish, he said, was adequately prepared. The fire, he said, was set a little low. He looked around the dining room with the slow inventory of someone who suspects things have been moved. And then, over the remove, he mentioned the mare. "I heard in the village," he said, "that no one has been able to get near that animal for years, and now one of your kitchen girls has apparently taken to visiting it at odd hours." He paused with his fork above his plate. "It seems an unusual state of affairs." Edmund looked at him. "She is a good judge of horses," Edmund said, and was mildly surprised to find that this was the whole of what he intended to say on the matter. Sir Geoffrey's expression was the expression of a man who has received a shorter answer than he wanted, and is deciding how to respond. "I only mention it," he said, "because it looks somewhat disordered. A kitchen girl in the stable yard. Rook must find it irregular. Rook," Edmund said, "has been unable to move that animal for 7 years." There was a brief silence. Sir Geoffrey moved on to the condition of the roads. Nora had been feeding Vesper carrots from her hand for 11 days. Not the carrots from the kitchen stores, which she had no authority to take. She had found, in the course of her work, that the vegetable scraps regularly contained carrot ends and outer leaves and potato peelings, and the sorts of things that horses were entirely willing to eat, and she had begun setting these aside in a particular corner of her apron pocket, with the methodical precision of someone who has worked out a system and intends to keep it. The first time she offered one Vesper had taken it with extreme caution, as though suspecting a trick. The second time she had taken it somewhat more confidently. By the 11th day she came to the fence when she heard Nora's step on the frozen ground. Nora did not run to tell anyone. She did not mention it at supper or in the attic room at night. She thought about it while she scrubbed and peeled and hauled and boiled, and it felt like a thing she wanted to keep for a while before it became common property. The way you might keep a letter until you were ready to read it all the way through. It was on the 12th day that she heard the Duke. She was at the fence in the early afternoon, on the thin excuse that she had been sent to the kitchen yard for water, and the kitchen yard and the stable yard shared a wall, and Vesper was at her shoulder breathing carrot breath into her ear when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. He was perhaps 30 feet away, at the far edge of the stable yard where the path from the house let out, and he had stopped walking. He was taller than she had imagined. She had seen him only from a distance, moving through the house on the errands of a man with a great deal of house to move through, with dark hair going slightly grey at the sides, and the look of someone who had recently been surprised. He was looking at the mare. Vesper had not moved at the sound of his footsteps. She had not pinned her ears or shifted her weight back. She was still standing with her nose over Nora's shoulder, breathing the way she breathed when she was easy. The Duke looked at the horse for a long time. Then he looked at Nora. She did not know what to say. She was aware that she was a kitchen girl standing in the wrong yard on a thin errand that would not bear close examination, and that the man looking at her was the Duke of Alderwick, and that these two facts were a problem she had not adequately prepared for. She said the only true thing she could think of. "She is not vicious, sir. She is only frightened." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I know." He went back to the house. That evening Sir Geoffrey found Edmund in the study and sat down without being invited, which was his habit, and told him that he had been speaking with Rook. "The groom is not happy," he said. "He considers it a slight on his management. A kitchen girl in his yard, visiting the animal he has been unable to handle, and now apparently the thing is standing still for her. He finds it humiliating." Edmund looked up from his correspondence. "What would you like me to do about it, Geoffrey?" It was not quite a question. Sir Geoffrey made the small sound he made when he wanted to say something pointed and was deciding how to point it. "I would like you to consider how it appears. You have a household to manage, Edmund, standards to maintain. If you allow every girl with an opinion about horses to wander your stable yard, Rook will not be the last man to feel his position undermined." Edmund set down his pen. "Has the mare been led out?" "What? Has anyone led Vesper out of her box in the last 7 years?" Sir Geoffrey was quiet. Edmund picked up his pen again. "Then, I think," he said, "that we do not yet know who has undermined what." Sir Geoffrey went to bed earlier than usual that night. It was the following Thursday when everything came apart. The neighbouring families arrived in the late morning, the Hallorans from Kestwick and the Beveridge party from the far side of the village. 3 carriages worth of people who had been invited 3 weeks before Sir Geoffrey appeared, and whose visit could not be reasonably cancelled. They were shown into the drawing-room and given tea, and Edmund moved among them with the performance of ease that years of such mornings had made second nature. The trouble started at 11:30. One of the Halloran boys, 16 and confident of his own horsemanship, had wandered with the permission of no one in particular toward the stable yard, and had, for reasons best known to himself, unlatched the paddock gate. Vesper came out at a gallop. She went across the south lawn with her mane flying, and the Halloran boy standing with the open gate in his hand, and a look on his face that was going to haunt him for some years, and the guests who had been walking the terrace scattered very efficiently in several directions, and the sound that went through the house brought Edmund out of the drawing-room at a pace that suggested the performance. Of ease had its limits. Nora heard it from the kitchen. She did not stop to think. She did not consider Mrs. Trail, or her position, or the Halloran boy, or the guests on the terrace. She pulled off her apron and went out the kitchen door and crossed the yard at a run, and came through the gate to the paddock, where Vesper was circling the south lawn in a wide, frightened arc, with 3 of the grooms trying to head her off and making it considerably worse. She stopped running. She walked. She walked out onto the lawn at a steady, even pace. and she did not look at the horse directly, and she did not reach out her hand, and she walked to a spot in the middle of the lawn and stood still. Vesper circled. Nora waited. The groom stopped moving because there was something in the quality of the stillness that made movement feel wrong. Vesper circled again, wider this time, and then tighter, and then she came in toward Nora from the left side in a long, slow curve, dropping her head as she came, and she walked the last 10 feet with her ears forward and pushed her face against Nora's shoulder. Nora put her hand on the mare her neck and held it there. The lawn was entirely silent. Edmund was standing at the terrace wall. Sir Geoffrey was standing beside him. Sir Geoffrey said, in the voice of a man who has prepared the sentence, that this was beyond question. A kitchen girl running onto the lawn in front of guests. Taking the Duke his property into her hands without authority. It was insubordination, and it was embarrassing, and if Edmund did not address it immediately then, Geoffrey was going to take that as a signal about the broader management of the estate that he was not going to be able to keep to himself. Edmund did not look at him. She needs to be dismissed, Geoffrey said. The girl. Today, whatever she does with that horse, you cannot keep a kitchen girl who believes she has the right to run into the middle of a social occasion and handle your property without permission. It sets a precedent you will not be able to walk back. Edmund was still watching Nora lead the mare across the lawn with one hand on her neck, slow and even, toward the paddock gate. He said, "She saved the mare from bolting into the road." Geoffrey said, "That is not the point." Edmund turned to look at him. "No," Edmund said. "I do not think it is." He left Sir Geoffrey on the terrace and walked down from the house onto the lawn, and the guests on the terrace watched him go, and the grooms watched him go, and the Halloran boy watched him go from the paddock gate, where he was still holding the latch with an expression of profound regret. Edmund walked across the lawn and came up beside Nora and the mare. Vesper looked at him. She did not step back. She moved her ears once, considering, and then let out a long, slow breath. Edmund looked at the horse for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. She was watching him the way she watched the mare. Quietly, without flinching, with her hands easy at her sides, she had grass on her boots and a dark streak on her sleeve from where the mare had leaned on her, and she did not look sorry for any of it. He said, "You knew she would not bolt." Nora said, "I thought she would not. I was not entirely certain." He was quiet for a moment. "How?" he said. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. When an animal is frightened, it will go toward the thing that has not yet hurt it, she said. If you are still enough and quiet enough, you become the safest thing in the field. They come to you not because you have asked them to, but because they have decided you are where the fear stops. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "I have been trying to get near that mare for 7 years. Nora looked at him, not sideways, the way she looked at the horse. Directly, the way she looked at something she was not afraid of. "I know," she said. "I have seen you." The guests on the terrace had gone very still. Sir Geoffrey had gone very still. Rook had gone very still. Edmund said, "I owe you an apology for allowing the situation with Mrs. Trail to proceed as long as it did." For now, he stopped. He tried again. "I should have been watching more carefully what was happening in my own yard," he said. What was actually happening, rather than the version of it that I had decided was true. Nora said, "It is a very old habit. I understand it." He looked at her. She was not speaking only about the horse, and they both knew it. He said, quietly enough that only she and the mare could hear it, "Will you come and work with her? Properly, not in the kitchen." The mare breathed against his shoulder. Nora looked at the horse and then back at him, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was the shape a smile comes from. "I will," she said. The guests from Kestwick and the far side of the village departed after luncheon and took the story with them in all directions, and by the following week it had reached the village in a form that was largely accurate, which was unusual for village news. Sir Geoffrey left on the Friday. He did not make a scene about it, because Edmund had a way of looking at him that made scenes feel poorly considered, and because whatever he had intended to say about the management of the estate had somehow lost its purchase in the days following the incident on the lawn. He told Edmund at breakfast that he hoped the girl knew what she was about. Edmund said, "I am quite certain she does." Sir Geoffrey departed at 11. Edmund watched the hired chaise go down the drive and felt something in his chest unknot slowly, like a rope that has been wet and has finally begun to dry. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were quiet in the particular way that Nora understood to be the best kind of quiet, the kind that comes after something has been resolved rather than before something is about to go wrong. She moved from the kitchen to the stable yard officially, with a wage that reflected the change and a room in the north wing that did not share a wall with the laundry. Mrs. Trail said nothing further on the subject, and Nora did not require her to. Rook left at the end of the month. The new head groom came from Lincolnshire, a practical man called Marsh, who had no prior opinions about the mare and was therefore easier to work with. Vesper was led out of her box for the first time in 7 years on a Wednesday morning in February. Nora walked beside her with one hand on her neck, and Edmund walked on the other side with his hands at his sides, and he did not touch the mare, and the mare did not object to his presence, which was more than had been achieved in 7 years, and felt to both of them like a considerable thing. They walked the length of the stable yard and back. Edmund said, "My brother used to say she was the steadiest horse on the property." Nora said, "She could be again." He said, "He was 17 when he fell. She did not say anything. She walked beside him and let the words settle. He said, 'I spent a long time being angry at the horse,' as though she had decided to hurt him, as though it had been a choice." Nora said, quietly, she was frightened. Whatever happened that day, something frightened her. He was quiet. "It is a good deal easier," he said, "to be angry than to think about what frightened her." "Yes," Nora said. They walked back to the stable in silence, and Vesper went into her box without difficulty, and stood there calm and solid, while Nora removed her halter, and Edmund leaned on the door-frame, and watched, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Nora." She looked up from the halter. He said, "I would like to tell you something, and I am going to need you to stand still for it, because I find I do not do this particularly well, and if you move I may lose my nerve." She stood still. He said, "I have been watching you for 2 months, not because I meant to, because you are the kind of person it is impossible not to watch, and not because you do extraordinary things, though you do, but because you do ordinary things with a quality of—" He stopped. "Attention," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly the word. You do ordinary things with complete attention, and I had forgotten that was possible, and being near it has been, she said. "I know. I have felt it too." He crossed the stable in 3 steps and took her hands in his and held them, and Vesper stood behind them breathing softly in the dark of the box, and the winter light came through the high window and lay across the straw in long pale bars, and neither of them moved for a moment, which was the right thing to do when something important was still settling. He said, "Will you stay?" She said, "I am not going anywhere." The spring came early to Alderwick Hall that year. The kitchen garden came up well, and Mrs. Petch was satisfied with the onions, and the drive was repaired where the frost had heaved it, and Vesper was taken out each morning with increasing confidence by Nora and by Edmund, and eventually, by the middle of March, by Nora and Edmund together, which the household noticed and said nothing about because the household was sensible. Sir Geoffrey wrote twice. Edmund replied briefly on both occasions. On a morning in late April, Nora stood in the stable yard in the early light, with the mare at her shoulder and Edmund at her side, and he put his hand over hers where it rested on the gate-post, and she did not move it. The yard was warm. The first warm morning since October, and it had that particular quality of warmth that was not yet certain of itself, still a little surprised to be here, the way all good things arrive slightly uncertain of their welcome. She had not come to Alderwick Hall to be chosen. But standing in the morning light with his hand over hers, and the old mare breathing warm against her shoulder, she thought perhaps this was what it felt like when something lost found its way home,